Okay, right, let's start. Hi there. Thank you so much for jumping on again today. Really great that you're joining us. Thank you. I'm Cheryl Lampard. Welcome to Knitting Knowledge and Pearls of Wisdom, Episode 5. I hope you're all getting on okay with the neck wrap that we started last week. Anyway, more of that later. So, as I said, I'm Cheryl Lampard. I'm an image consultant with Style Matters International, but I'm a passionate sewer and knitter. And knitting in particular has always been something that I've found very therapeutic and relaxing. And I used to own a yarn shop in Brighton, England called Yomo, which means hair of the sheep. Anyway, let me just hold tight. We're turning around so that we can actually get rid of some stuff and start with what's important. So, we're going to do a few things today, and I want to dig a bit deeper into pattern instructions and in particular the abbreviations. And I'm putting these little signs here when we change topic so that if you are watching this later or you want to watch it again, you can fast forward to the bits you need. So I'm now going to move that out the way, and I'm going to bring these things. These are patterns, and of course, and patterns all have their own way of describing things. Most of them, and the good patterns will always give you abbreviations. This one gives you all the abbreviations that you need to make this particular item. This one, not so much. It does give you some of the more technical things that they do, but not as many as you might like. But there are some very basic pattern abbreviations. And I've done this sheet for you of basic knitting abbreviations. It's not a definitive list by any means, and there are many more terms and abbreviations, but I wanted to give you a basic glossary. Now, I've discovered that I can't actually put this as a PDF on this Facebook page, but I'll post it afterwards as a JPEG if you'd like it, a copy of it. I may be able to post it as a PDF on my Style Matters page, but I'll let you know. Or simply private or direct message me with your email address and I'll be happy to send it to you. It's a useful thing to keep handy. And bear in mind also that terminology might be slightly different in British patterns and Canadian patterns as opposed to US. But I've based my list on US terminology as that's where I live. Okay, we're going to start with, okay, I've got to work how that's going to be seen. Gauge, or tension as it's commonly known in the UK, means the same thing. And I did touch on this a bit last week, but I wanted to get into it a bit more. On every ball of yarn, and certainly every pattern, but let me just show you this ball band, it will give you the weight of the yarn. We talked about that last week. This is a chunky yarn, a bulky yarn. It's number 5. And here it will give you the size of needles and indeed crochet hooks. We're going to talk about knitting needles because that's what we're doing here. And unless it says otherwise, it bases this on a 4-inch square. So in this case, this means if you're knitting to the gauge that they want you to knit the pattern at, it's 13.5 stitches and 20 rows based on a size 6.5 millimeter needle, and that's a 10.5 in US sizes. So what you have to do is knit a pattern square or a tension square. Now, when I was younger, I hated knitting tension squares. I just wanted to get on with my knitting. But now it's the first thing I do because every yarn is different. And more to the point, every knitter knits differently. I'm just going to move something in here so you can, I'm going to demonstrate on in a second. I'll talk about these in a second. When I had Yomo, at one point I had something like 15 knitters knitting for me. And what I would do whenever I had a new knitter, I would make them knit, I would ask them to knit a tension square because I needed to know how they knitted, because everybody knits slightly differently. Some people knit absolutely to the tension that they're given. Some people knit looser and tighter, and it's just one of those inherent things. You knit in a way that you knit. Now you can alter that by going up or down a needle size to get the correct tension. And what I've done here is a sample based on this ball band that I just showed you, on this ball band here. So I used the 6.5mm needle, the size 10.5 needle here, to do my tension squared, to do my gauge. They're pinned like this because I blocked them out this morning so that they would lie flat, but I kept them on the pad so you could see them. Now, what I always do, remembering that there are nearly always more rows than they are to the stitch. So it depends what pattern you're using, but if you're using a stockinette stitch, your actual rows are going to be, your stitch is wider than your row. So you're nearly always going to have more rows to the 4 inches than stitches. But this pattern, or this ball band, says the tension to knit is at 13.5 stitches and 20 rows. Now, it's always easier to cast on more stitches than you need. So I think I cast on, what did I cast on here? Something like 18 stitches, can't remember now. Just so that I could get a good guide, so that it's not distorted maybe by my end stitches. Now, this little handy dandy tool here I use this all the time, and it's a really good way to check your tension. Now, admittedly, it's not going to give us 4 inches, but that doesn't matter. We can actually base this on our 2 inch. It's cleverly marked here with 2 inch this way and that way. So let's just count those stitches and see if I'm right, if I'm to tension or not. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've actually got 7 stitches there. Now, if we multiplied that by 2 to give us the 4 inches, that would give me 14 inches, and they want 13.5. Okay, not too bad. Let's see how many rows I've got. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10.5 rows, and they want 20 rows for 4 inches. So you can see my tension is a little bit tighter than they want. Now, I would say here it's going to depend what I'm going to knit. If I was knitting a garment, that could be quite important depending on the fit of the garment, because it's not just that half a stitch there and the extra stitch that way. By the time I've got that across several inches for a width of a garment, that could seriously make my garment smaller than I want it. So I would have to adjust my tension by going maybe up a needle size and then trying it out again. And to show you the difference here, I've done exactly the same number of stitches and the same number of rows on a smaller needle. Now this needle is a size 5, which 5mm, sorry, I do think in millimeters when it comes to needles, which is a size 8 in American. And again, a bulky yarn, you can go anything from a size 8 to an 11 needle. So I'm on the smallest size that they, or the first size that they recommend here for this type of yarn. Let's see the difference now. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to count my stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now I've got 8 stitches there, so in 2 inches. So if that was 4 inches, that would be 16 stitches, and they want 13.5. That's a big difference. Let me see how many rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So I've got 11, that would be 22 rows. Again, they want 20. So my tension is obviously much smaller. It's a smaller needle. Now, again, if that's a garment and they've used that size needle, that's fine. But if they haven't, I'm going to have to adjust up or down depending, and I'd have to go up a size. So you can see the difference that a gauge makes. If I'm doing a scarf, I'm not going to worry about that. If I'm doing a blanket or squares, I'm not really going to worry so much about my tension as long as I get the measurements that I want. But it's an important thing to do, and I would recommend when you do your tension squares, do them in stocking stitch or do them in the pattern that it tells you to do, because if it says that the gauge is whatever it is based on stocking stitch, that's the tension piece that you must do. If it says over the pattern, then you must do a pattern piece, because different patterns will pull the yarn in, it'll pull the material in, or it may even loosen it up. If you're doing something in a lace pattern, by the time you've blocked that, and again you need to block your piece when it's done to get the true measurement. So often lace knitting, it's kind of sitting on your lap and looks like a piece of chewing gum or something that cat has wrestled with, but you need to block it out because that's when you get your true gauge. So do those squares, and you can do something useful with those squares. They're very useful for keeping later, to if you're going to the shops, when we're allowed to go to the shops again, when we can do that, to match buttons or other notions that you might need to finish off your piece. If you want to do a test piece to see how it's going to wash or steam or press, keep those little squares. And you can actually do bigger squares too, and then turn them into a blanket or an afghan, something like that, which is what we're going to talk about in a minute. So I'm going to move this little thing here. Now I'm going to show you how to do something really exciting. Now we're going to do, my sign has got a bit curly there. We're going to do cables. You're going to find cables a lot in your knitting patterns, and they make wonderful detail. That they're more complicated, how they look more complicated than they actually are to do, and they give a really nice texture. That was always the thing many years ago. You could always tell a machine knit garment from a hand knit one when you looked at the cables, because they just didn't have, the machine knit garments just didn't have the depth of a hand knitted cable. Excuse me 1 second while I take a sip. Okay, so here is a piece that here's one I did earlier for anyone that knows what Blue Peter is. Okay, I probably need to turn that round so the camera can see it. Have you got that okay? Okay. So here, and I did a big square here. This is about 9.5 inches, this square. And because I'm going to do more squares, and this is the next project, I think, or this could be an ongoing project, that every time we do a sample, do a nice big square, or you can do your square whatever size you want. This is a 9-inch square. You could do a 4-inch square. You could do 9-inch squares, 8 inches, whatever you want. But keep them all and start with a border, because we're going to end up sewing these together. And in a future episode, I will show you a variety of different ways to show these, to seam these together, and in fact to knit them together in a couple of cases. What I've done here is, the one in the middle is probably the sort of cable that you're used to seeing. This is a 6-stitch and a 6-row cable, which means it's 6 stitches wide, and every time I do this twist, it's 6 rows between the twists. Now, either side of this, it's exactly the same cable, but it looks very different. This is a wave cable, and this side I've done it facing that way, this one this way. The technique is exactly the same, but it's the way I've twisted the cable. And I once made a sweater where I was halfway up it and realized I'd made an error in one of the cables, and it was coming out like a wave stitch. So I just actually kept it on the sweater sides and carried on as if that was how it was meant to be, and it really looked very nice at the end of it. So you can sometimes make a mistake into a really nice design. So I'm going to show you now how to do a cable. What you do need to do a cable is a cable stitch, a cable needle, and that's basically a double pointed end. Yeah, I can't see what's going on in the camera at the moment. So these are cable needles. You can get quite small ones. Obviously, if you're doing very fine work, you can't use chunking great cable needle for your stitches. And again, if you're doing thicker work, you probably need a cable needle that's a bit thicker. In a pinch, you can do it without a cable needle. I'm not going to show you that because it's slightly more advanced and it's easy to lose stitches. But you can use something like a cocktail stick if you have one, if you can't find a cable needle. You can use a double pointed needle. They tend to be a bit longer, so a little bit more unwieldy, but use what you have to hand. So I'm going to show you how to do that, and I'm probably going to use this one. And cable needles don't come in the size range that knitting needles do, but there's usually sort of thin and thicker ones. Okay, I'm moving this out the way now. And all I did here, I just broke the pattern up with this single knit stitch, and I knitted into the back of it. Again, we did that knitting into the back of the stitch a couple of weeks ago in our ribbing lesson. And I just did side stitches of garter stitch. Okay, I'm moving that out, and I'm going to show you how to do your cable. So I started off here. I'm going to show you how to do both of those cables. I started off here. I started just with, so that you could see what was happening, I just started off with an edge stitch and then 4 purl stitches, then my 6 knit stitches for my cable, then another 4, then another 6, then another 4 on my edge stitch. A 6 stitch cable is not the only one. You can have 4 stitch cables, you can have 8 stitch cables, but the 6 stitch and 6 row cable is one of the most widely used, but you can alter the depth of them depending on the look that you want. And there are some designs where the cable where you do the twist alters at every so often, and it makes for a really interesting pattern, but you just want it to look intentional rather than an error. Anyway, I'm going to just adjust my position a bit so that the camera can see my hands. So there's my cable needle. I'm going to move that out of the way. I'm going to do my first knit stitch, my edge stitch. I'm going to do my 4 purl stitches. Now I'm going to do a regular cable here, so I'm going to take 3 of my stitches off my left hand needle, and I'm going to put them on my cable needle, and I'm going to hold them at the back of my knitting. This will seem a bit cumbersome at first. What I tend to do is just hold it between those 2 fingers. That's why I say if you have a really long needle, it's a bit difficult. So try and have a cable needle or a cocktail stick or something a bit shorter. Okay, now I'm going to put my yarn at the back, and I'm going to knit the 3 stitches from that 6 stitch cable that I've already set in plan. I'm going to knit those. I've still got my cable needle holding those stitches at the back. Okay, now that looks like it's pulling over. That's exactly how it's meant to look. Now I take my cable needle and I knit the 3 stitches off of those. Okay. And at the moment it looks like a sort of strangled mess, but I promise you, once I've done another couple of rows, it'll start looking like a cable. I'm going to show you how to do the wave stitch now, the wave stitch cable, so that you can see the difference. It's actually twisted the same way this first time round. So I'm going to take my 3 stitches and I'm going to put them at the back. I'm going to knit my 3 stitches off my left hand needle, then I'm going to knit my 3 off my cable needle. Okay. Now I'm going to purl these 4. if you're, please don't hesitate to write questions into the comments box. I can't actually see them at the moment, but I will get to them as soon as this is done, and it will be posted on Facebook afterwards. I promise you I will get to any questions you have. So this is the wrong size. This is what it looks on the wrong size. It's kind of a bit gnarled there, but it will all come beautifully apparent. So I'm just going to go along. Yes, I'm doing, remember your pearls on the wrong side row will be knits. Sorry, your pearls that look on the right side will be knits on the wrong side, and vice versa. Your knits on the right side are pearls on the wrong side. Cables are just lovely things. They also are really nice for winter garments because you actually have a much thicker fabric. That's why very often rugged sweaters, Aran sweaters, really have a lot of stitch pattern, and certainly cables, because you're getting double the thickness. So it makes them really cozy. Did I drop a stitch? No. 1, 2, 3, 4. And my end stitch. I would suggest always doing an end stitch or 2 on your sample squares, on your tension squares. Okay, so you can see now the bases of the cable forming, and both are going the same way. I'm going to whip down another row, just knit some pearls here. So it's my 4 pearls here to start with. Six knit stitches. Stitches, and you'll also see how the fabric pulls in, which is why when you're doing your gauge sample, it's really important, if the garment or whatever you're knitting has cables in it, that you do the swatch with the pattern, because if that's what they ask you to do. Sometimes they'll just say it's based on this many rows and that many stitches in stocking or stocking net stitch. I'm going on my return row now, wrong side row, and that's fine. If that's what they tell you to do, then do it, because what they're doing there is basing the pattern dimensions on that stockinette stitch and assuming that your tension will be the same throughout. But if they say it's based on a certain amount of stitches and rows over the pattern, then you must do it over the pattern, because it's going to just give you a completely different result. And there's no wrong or right tension. Don't think you're doing the wrong tension, and you're not. It's just the way you knit. And everybody knits slightly differently. Once I start knitting in really big chunky yarn, my tension goes a bit off, whereas it tends to be spot on for fine yarns. And I told you about the lady that wasn't very good knitting in cotton yarns. Her tension was way off there, but it was beautiful in woolen yarns and fluffy yarns. Just depends. And sometimes it can even depend on the needles that you're using. Some needles give you a, they're not so easy to handle. Some give you a tighter tension. It's one of those things that really is person to person. Okay, I would normally do 6 rows, but I don't want to keep you sitting here just watching me knit the same thing all the time. So we're going to do a cable on the 4th row this time. It's the same technique, but I don't want you to just have to sit watching me knit. There's no pleasure in that for you, I'm sure. Right, so this is our traditional cable. And I'm going to take my 3 stitches off. I'm going the same way again. 3 stitches off the left hand needle. I'm holding them at the back. I'm putting my yarn at the back, and I'm knitting my 3 stitches off my left hand needle. Then I'm going to knit them off my cable needle. So far, so good. Then I'm going to purl to my next cable, my plastic needles are sticking. Now this is where I'm going the other way with my cable, so I get the wave pattern. I'm taking my 3 off my left hand needle and I'm putting it at the front of my work now, and I'm going to put my yarn at the back. I'm going to knit my 3 stitches off my left hand needle. Now I'm going to knit the 3 stitches off my cable needle. And if it feels cumbersome at first, that's absolutely fine. You're dealing with a 3rd needle and you've been used to 2. Don't worry, you'll get the hang of it. I'm going to purl, then I'm going to do another row on the wrong side, and then you'll see how the pattern has formed. Remember, I've just not done an extra couple of rows. I've done a 4-row cable there. Doesn't matter, you can do that. Just decide how you want it or what the pattern says. There's nothing wrong in a 4-row 6-stitch cable. You can actually have an 8-row 6-stitch cable too. You can have it how you want it. I just want to show you what we're doing. Again, on the back, on the wrong side row, easy. It's just the knit and purls that you know and hopefully love by now. And if you get really clever, you can start doing different coloured cables. That can be very effective. But that's a lesson for another time. Okay, when I turn this round, can you see how, and if I bring the big sample back in, you can see that your cable is forming there, and this way it's going this way. So this is exactly what I did here. I started going this way, and then what you would do for the next twist, you're always going to do this one. If you want your regular cable, you're always going to do that with the stitches at the back. So you're bringing the left, if you will, the left, it's a left cross, if you will, it's a left cross. Sorry, it's not. It's a right cross. I beg your pardon. Look, you can see that's going right. That's a right cross. This is the left cross. But when you work further up for the wave stitch, you're going to alternate. With your wave stitch, you're going to do a left cross, a right cross, a left cross, a right cross. That's what forms the wave. With your regular cable, you're just going to always do a right cross. Again, if this was a sweater, you might find that sometimes you'll find that the sweater halves, that they'll twist the cable the other way so that it sort of balances it up. Not always, but again, you'll find it's such an easy pattern stitch, but it looks more complicated than it is. And if this was, getting ahead of it here, but if I was going to split this, if this was going up the center of a sweater maybe, and this was a V-neck starting from here, I could then actually take my cables up the side of the V-neck. There's an awful lot you can do with cables, and it's really worth playing with because it's such a fun stitch and you get a wonderful effect from it. So I hope you found that interesting. I'm going to work on some other 9-inch squares, and please do the same. Or if you want any other ideas for stitch patterns, I think each week we're trying to do a new stitch pattern that you can make into a square, and then at the end of several weeks we'll have enough to sew them up into an afghan or a blanket, which would be fun. Or if you haven't done very many, that's fine. We can make a little cushion cover. That's fine too. It's just a way of having your knitting as a reference and making a nice project at the same time. So let me know through the week how you're getting on. Let me know if you've got any questions. Post any photographs. I'll be happy to answer any issues that you have. Remember, it's knitting. Don't get in a knot with your knitting. The only knots that should be in your knitting are at the end of a row. Don't you get all knotted up. So until next week, stay safe, stay home, keep calm, and keep knitting. Bye for now. See you next week.